Now we can open up to the results of the 4 parallel workshops presented by the rapporteurs. So I invite all the rapporteurs to come up here and to start our discussion. Please, Angela, do you want to?
Well, I guess you can just, so you're handing them to me. We are adapting over time. So all the rapporteurs are here. Excellent. We are missing one workshop. We have 3. We need, so we have workshop 1, workshop 2, workshop 4. We need workshop 3. Ah, she's loading the presentation. Okay. Yes. No problem at all. We need another when we will. Okay. Well, we are not going to have, unfortunately, a coffee break, but of course you can stretch while considering anyhow that we have a transition between our keynote speakers that I think really helped us to put the work of the 4 workshops that will be summarized now in the broader context. We started actually with the future, with the foresight that RIM was providing us. What can we expect about our region, the Mediterranean region, up to 2030 with the green, blue, and red scenario. And it's true that we need to be optimistic and see what we are doing already, which is a lot. But RIM was also telling us that the business as usual scenario equals the red scenario, the threat one. So this means that we are adaptive, but we need to speed up the gear or change the way we are adapting. And we are optimists, and we think that research and innovation is one of the elements to speed up the gear while not replacing other interventions, including political, economic, and strategic. And then we had, of course, the historical view, remembering how the ancient Romans and the Venetians actually did things that are innovative even with our current standards. They didn't have the infrastructures, but we had good brains. And clearly, they had possibly a challenging environment, but an environment that they could still manage with certain adaptation. And I think that the fascinating focus on the various interfaces that Alberto Basset was how to say, developing are definitely the key word of this whole conference. The idea really being what are the links between the inland and marine water. And when we speak about inland and marine water, we don't speak only about water, but we speak of the species which are in the water, sometimes humans as well, for a short period of times. And of course, those who are using water for various sectors, very often in competition, and therefore we need to see what the sectors that we human and other species are using, and how this competition can be better understood, described, analyzed, and hopefully where can we find synergies to make sure that complementarities and synergies are found rather than competitions that take us from the, instead of the green or blue development, they keep us in the red ones. So with this little introduction also to give our 3rd workshop rapporteur the time to join us at the table, I would like to give the floor on behalf also of Enrico to the rapporteur for the 1st workshop. Just to remind ourselves, the 1st workshop was the one on water resources and land management impacts on inland and seawater in the Mediterranean region. We had actually two rapporteurs, Ayman Rabi, who is with us and will introduce, and Michael Blind, who yesterday was a multitask person doing rapporteur chairing and various tasks. So, Ayman, the floor is yours for a short synthesis of workshop 1. Thank you. And we have also a bit of music to keep us entertained.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the organizers for this invitation and for allowing us to participate in this very important really conference that we hope that we at least could contribute toward deriving some sort of recommendations out of the discussions that has been at least taken place yesterday in the water group. Of course, as you can imagine, as a rapporteur, trying to emphasize or synthesize a lot of good ideas, it's not an easy task. Of course, I am sure, despite all what we are going to present here, there is a lot more in the presentations that I encourage everybody who is interested to look into the details of the presentations to take the kind of more original ideas from the presentations. Just bear a little bit with me to understand the technology, how it works, and then we will, yes. Of course, just start by giving a little bit of background information about the basin, which is just a repetition of what has been said, but it is just a reminder for all of us that the basin is a home of nearly 7.4% of the world population, with a total population of around 468 million people. It is growing rapidly, especially in the southern part of the basin. Yet the available water resources are only forming 2.6% of the total world potential, with a volume of 1,060 cubic kilometer of water in total. In addition to that, of course, water is unevenly distributed in the basin from north to south, where the northern part is, of course, having 84% of the total water resources, while the southern part is only 16%, where also the population concentration is much larger and the aridity of the south is much larger. Yet, of course, the discussion yesterday in the presentations and in the workshop was focusing a bit on what kind of issues we already know and what are the kind of challenges that we all agree that is facing the Mediterranean and the water sector in general. So we tried to list some of these items and challenges and what we already know. These challenges are something related to natural causes and something or part of them related to the human-induced pressures that we can talk about. So water scarcity is increasing in the Mediterranean as a result of the spatial and temporal changes in climate. The increase in the extreme events is yet adding another complexity to these kind of already complex situation. Population is rapidly growing, as we mentioned, especially in the south, and so does water demand associated with the various developmental needs. It is expected that the demand will increase by 25 in or toward the year 2025. The human activities, the land use and development at both catchment upstream level as well as the coastal level is posing a major threat to both inland as well as marine water quality and quantity. The increased scarcity, the shared nature of main water resources are creating more sectorial as well as other types of conflicts among the users as well as countries who are sharing these resources. The water management is highly influenced by politics, and decisions are often taken in favor of the stronger sector, which also emphasizes here the sectoral approach, not really the integrated approach. And therefore, when we look at the environment representation in this kind of overall plans, because it is the weaker sector, it is not really well addressed and it is not taking place within the kind of plans developed at the basin level. Stakeholder participation in planning and management of resources is not well established in most parts of the basin, and societal priorities and needs are not well addressed also in the water management plans. Therefore, sometimes plans are really just also based in the politics and political interest. The awareness related to the acuteness of the water problem at public as well as decision maker level is not sufficient, and the water use efficiency is low, especially in irrigation. So existing scientific knowledge and data is not communicated well to both public as well as decision makers, and we often as researchers talking to ourselves and assuming that because we know the story, everybody else is knowing it, so we need a language that it is really synthesizing and summarizing and make it easier for others to understand what we are talking about. The low economic situation in the southern part of the basin is considered a major barrier to develop and adopt advanced technological solutions for the different water problems that we can talk about. The social and cultural acceptability of some of the water management aspects, the technologies, especially in relation to reuse or treated effluent reuse, is still a major issue of concern. And it is vary from place to place. The water pricing is still a political decision, and it is really a politically sensitive issue rather than it is based on kind of reliable reflection of the actual cost in several parts of the basin. Solving water problems has been realized by exploiting existing freshwater resources on the assumption that it is easier and it is cheaper. And therefore, of course, more dams are proposed and planned and constructed, more wells are drilled in order to extract groundwater, and therefore this has caused severe exploitation and overexploitation of inland waters, both surface and groundwater. It altered their quality and it influenced the water cycle and affected ecosystems and the services they are providing for these systems. The advances in technology yet is promising, and of course the innovative technologies that we've been hearing about is really promising that there will be some sort of solutions in terms of developing non-conventional water resources and releasing the pressure over the conventional water sources. In addition to the problems related to the technology, we still talk about the existing institutional setup, and the governance and water integrity in many parts of the basin needs further attention and reforms. And we still need also more harmonized action plans at the basin level, which is still lacking, and especially when we talk about the Mediterranean water strategy and the related action plan, that it is not yet adopted as an example of this kind of overall collective plans for the entire basin. So this is what we already know and what is the challenges, but there is also many things that we still do not know, and I think this is an area where we need to focus our kind of strategy and our kind of, recommendations for further actions, whether research or policy or cooperation. The implication and uncertainties related to the proposed technological solutions of developing non-conventional water resources, in particular, the infiltration of nanoparticles, the pharmaceutical substances into the receiving bodies, whether it is surface water, groundwater, or even the sea, is not yet well understood, and therefore their impact on human health and environment is not well understood, and therefore it needs further studies and research before we really can jump into recommending any of these technological solutions as part of the kind of solution for the water problem that we are talking about. The exact climate behavior and more precise downscaling to better understand the occurrence of extreme hydrological events and their impact on local as well as freshwater and mid-sea ecosystem is also needed, because we still talk about like global circulation models and therefore like major scales or mega scales, not really understanding well how it is reflected at local scale and maybe at catchment level. This is why we need further investigations to understand better how this kind of impact at local level that can influence the overall basin level in general. We don't know as well the level of knowledge that it exists in relation to the best practices, and if there is any other existing research fields where they are tackling part of the issues that we are really interested in. And as an example, the nutrient recovery issue that has been presented yesterday is something maybe addressed in other research areas that we still need to link to and need to understand better how these kind of research are really tackling the issues, and how we can, as a multidisciplinary team, working together so that we can combine these results and plan in an integrated manner rather than just individual separate planners. The existing capacity and information in the area of extreme hydrological phenomena at local and basin level is not yet also well understood. How national plans can influence, whether it is positively or negatively, the overall water and marine environment in the basin is not yet also well understood, and therefore more harmonization of plans will be needed. The capacity and willingness of various countries at the basin to cooperate to address the various challenges ahead is also something to be explored further, and the magnitude and fate of inland and marine water interaction and reciprocal influence also need to be further studied so that we can understand better the overall picture, how this kind of, whether it's upstream or downstream, coast or highland, is really influencing the kind of catchment, the kind of ecosystems, and the kind of water bodies, including the Mediterranean Sea, that we are really addressing and interested in it. So with this kind of issues and recommendations that we, of course, still need to have more information, we are proposing some sort of actions that it is really assisting or that can assist in overcoming part of these problems. I agree with Dr. Ayadi that business as usual scenario is no longer a possibility, and I think we need to have a more kind of non-conventional way of thinking to address the non-conventional problems that we are facing. And therefore, we are proposing to have a more participatory and scientifically based and lower politically influenced water planning or water plans. We also need to define the most prominent and successful practices and cooperation patterns, or at least cooperation that exists, which has real contribution to address and solve the problems, to ensure their contribution, to ensure their further development as well as sustainability. We need to diversify the technology and the technological aspects, innovative technology, in order to address various problems related to the water issues, and we need to start with low cost and small scale in order to also match it with the overall, like, let's say, economic situation and the diversified economic situation within the basin, whether it is in south or in the north. We need to have more attention to the social and environmental aspects of water-related planning and management, because this is yet another area which is still not particularly covered. We need a capacity building for water practitioners as well as mid-level managers, but also to ensure better adaptation and mitigation issues. This includes informal capacity building through exchange of knowledge at user or farmer or even mid-level practitioners, farmer to farmer or practitioner to practitioner, as well as formal capacity building in order to emphasize some of the newly or the new concepts that we are really interested in order to match the kind of reality that we are facing. We need also to raise decision makers' awareness and to close the science policy knowledge gap, because this is very important aspect that we still feel that the scientists, although producing a good science, this results is not really conveyed well to the decision-making level, and therefore we need to define language that it is really appropriate so that we can convert the scientific language into a more kind of really understood language by the policymakers and the decision makers in order to close this gap. There is also a crucial need to better understand the implication of food, water, energy nexus. And here it is important to improve the efficiency and reduce costs, especially in agriculture and in irrigation in particular, where we just highlighted that the inefficiency in irrigation is really high, and therefore agriculture is yet the major water consumer in the basin, and therefore we need to emphasize this within the context of water, food, energy, and space in particular, because these are the fourth pillar of this kind of nexus that we are talking about in terms of land and land use allocated to this. To review the standards and norms currently in use to match the new emerging reality under climate and global changes. I think we all agree that there is a new reality, and therefore the standards that has been set maybe decades or 2 decades ago is no longer probably adequate, so that we need to revise it in the light of what we are really talking about and what challenges we are facing. We need to ensure a better integrity and encourage voluntary reforms. So voluntary reforms is here really something key, because we do not want countries to go into reforms because they are subsidized to get the reform. The reform should be like seen as a kind of a need, and therefore countries go for reform so that they can contribute toward improving the situation and really be an active partner within the overall planning. We need also reforms to support the development of more sustainable water and marine environment in the basin. To develop further cooperation and capacity at the basin level to better understand the extreme hydrological events. This includes investing in early warning systems, exchange real-time data, develop frequent lower time step monitoring procedures, and like this kind of issues will help in better understanding the occurrence of the extreme hydrological events, whether it's drought or floods. We need to ensure the inclusion of social and environmental costs in water pricing, and ensure affordability by the poor while realizing service and resource sustainability, which is also something that we need to look into more, like cost-effective pricing, and avoid very much the political kind of interest that it is encountered with that. Of course, we need also new approaches and new definitions of water budgets and water cycles. We need to differentiate, like, for example, some people are talking about the soil cycle and some people are talking about water cycle, and we are mixing the two by like including the nutrients in the water cycle that should not be in the water cycle, it should be in the soil cycle. And therefore we need to define new numbers, we need to define new budgets within the kind of, or in the light of the emerging new water or non-conventional water resources. We need also to prioritize the use and of course take into account the social, ecological realities and needs. It is important to reverse the current pollution level of the Mediterranean Sea before it reaches the irreversible situation, and we need more harmonized regulation and more investment in cleanups, whether it is in the catchment upstream or in the level of the Dead Sea and coastal areas themselves. So thank you very much. I think this is what we had in our group.
Thank you, shukran.
Afwan.
Well, I was actually in that session for most of the time, and I don't know whether there are other participants in the session, particularly our leader Antonio, who was the film director of the session, whether there was more to be added, but I think that our two rapporteurs managed really to provide an extremely rich synthesis of what was said in terms of both the diagnosis of the issues, what is the state, what do we know, and what we need to know better or more. So I'm really, I think it was really an impressive work. Thanks really to both of you. So the question is whether there is anyone who was attending that session and would consider very important to add one point. Otherwise, we consider everybody is quite satisfied for the time being, and of course, in view of the report, we will have more time. Anything from participants in that session? If not, thanks again to all participants and the rapporteurs, and Michael. We go then to the second session. Enrico is leaving me the task for the time being. So the second workshop, as you know, was the Mediterranean Integrated Ocean Observing System to support sustainable coastal and marine tourism. And our rapporteur is Erik Buch. So we are looking forward to listen to your synthesis of workshop 2. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we had two subjects in our workshop. It was marine tourism and then observations, ocean observations, and we should try to link them together. There was no really presentations on the marine tourism, but some of the speakers had some background information that I want to give a short overview of. So the drivers for tourism, there's a lot of people, jobs, there's a lot of money involved in this. Here is some numbers where you can see that there are more than $200 billion in revenue in 2011, which is 40 times the value in 1970. So big growth also over the years. And if we focus a little bit on the Mediterranean, which is the subject of this conference, we can from these figures see that the Mediterranean is covering a big share of this coastal tourism. It's close to 50% if we sum up for the European area. So there is a really great industry in the Mediterranean on tourism. This is to show that where the coastal tourism is in the Mediterranean Sea. We can see that the major part is in the European part, but also there are activities in the northern part of Africa as well. And please keep that in mind when I show a figure later on. So there is activity in the entire Mediterranean. That is the message from this figure here. And of course, with a little higher concentration in the European part. There are also some prognoses showing that the tourist industry will still continue to grow over the coming years up to 2030. So there is still some issue here the planning has to be taken into account and do it in the right way, and that's some of the issues that I will touch upon later on. If we focus on coastal tourism, there are some benefits. Of course, there is economy involved in this on a national level as well as on a local level, and for the local, it can create jobs. There's an issue of improving the infrastructure in order to cope with all these visitors. And there is an increased investment in natural and cultural sites, and also putting focus on other local economic activities. But there are also some pressures that we have to take into account, and that is probably those that we have to relate to in order to also focus on the observation part, which is the other subject of this. So here's a list of, say, effects of having coastal tourism, and which is not necessarily positive. And in relation to the water, there's pollution and so on. So negative impacts on that, which has to be addressed, especially if as we see, there is a potential for further growth the coming years. This is just to illustrate, give an impression on how things can change over a very, very short time span in a coastal area. This is two pictures from the same site, but with 40 years in between. So there has been a lot of buildings and so on, very, very close to the coast. And that is perhaps an issue that has to be considered. But I'm coming from Northern Europe, and we are really copying this strategy of building very, very close to the coast. because of course it's attractive, and but it has some consequences. Deltas are one of the very vulnerable areas in the coast, and we had a very nice presentation from how this was investigated in Spain. And there are some threats to that, especially in relation to climate change, which has to be taken into account. And this is just to illustrate that regulation, human regulation, can really alter such a system in many ways. And this has to be taken into account when we do planning of such an area. So, in principle, we have some conflicts here. Because on the one side, we want to say, okay, we have economy, which means growth, it means jobs. And if you know all about the discussion of blue growth going on in Europe for the time being, this is coastal tourism, or marine tourism in general, is one part of blue growth. And here, when we talk about blue growth, we talk about growth, economic growth, but we also talk very much about generating new jobs. So that is on the one side, but on the other side, we have to focus also on a sustainable environment, meaning I was attending the Euro-Ocean conference a couple of weeks ago, and there it was introduced blue growth on the one side, but we have green growth on the other side, and we have to have them to match somehow. And that's, in principle, a conflict. So we have a challenge, how to develop coastal tourism patterns that will not reduce benefits to the tourists and the local population, but still will preserve the quality of the natural resources for the tourism. And the use of coastal areas in a sustainable development framework shall rely on monitoring tools for the ecological status of the coast and the shoreline. So now we are turning over to how to match this. And this is what we would like to have, to establish somehow the bridge between science and decision making. With science we mean that we are measuring the environment, we are trying to gain knowledge out of it, and we are ready with data, modeling data, and so on, to give good advice to decision makers. That's an ideal situation. With regard to measurements, we have available today a large number of systems that we can use. Remote sensing is an important part. It gives a very good overview of an ocean area, but only on the surface, of course. So therefore, we also need other observation instruments in order to gain knowledge about what is going on below the surface. So we have drifting floats, we have fixed observation points, ships of opportunity, gliders, research vessel, coastal network, tide gauges, and so on. And that has to be integrated into such a system. But there are gaps. There is a lot of measurements going on, no doubt about that. But there are still gaps in that. Gaps in space, in time, and especially in parameters where we now are ready to observe biogeochemical parameters. There's certainly a gap in long-term commitment, and we need an integrated monitoring strategy on a European level, which also means the Mediterranean Sea, of course. This is just to give you a couple of examples. You can see on this figure here, there is a lot of observations, physical parameters being observed in the Mediterranean Sea. We also see that there is an imbalance between north and south. So if you remember the figure I showed earlier on the tourism, we have tourism in Europe and in North Africa. We have here some data that can support decision-making on coastal tourism in Europe, but there are none in Africa, or very, very scarce at least. And the other question you need to raise here is, yes, we have observations, but is it observations on the right spot? Is it observation on the right time? And so on. So there need to be a kind of evaluation of the system that we have. Do it fit for purpose, so to speak? Another example, just to see that there are also observations in the biological components. Here is phytoplankton. Again, we have the north-south imbalance. Remote sensing can level out a little bit this north-south imbalance. So here's an example of a remote sensing product from the North African side. We see some pollution things very close to where there is some of the tourist sites. But as I mentioned before, remote sensing is a very good tool in the way that you have broad overview. It's repeated, but it's only the surface. One of the things that I talk very much about in Europe today is that we should try to generate an observation system that measures once, but can be used for several purposes. There's a cost-benefit thing in this. So trying to establish a system where you invest in instrumentation and maintenance of that, but you use the data, collect the data, share the data, and can use it for various purposes. I have tried to mention a few here, and we can see coastal marine ecosystems is one of them. Another issue is integrated coastal zone management, which is a way to try to analyze and use this information that we collect and use it in a decision process. So this is a definition of integrated coastal zone management. And here, in order to take the example, this was what was presented yesterday in our session, how to use this tool in the process of coastal tourism, so that we collect data and we try to analyze and we put it into a context where it can be used for a very good decision process. Another thing is the dialogue with stakeholders. It's important when we design things and when we generate products and so on, that we have a close dialogue with the stakeholders in order to understand what kind of information they want, so that we can we can present our data, our services, our products in a way that is understandable for them and is usable in their process. So, to sum up of what we discussed yesterday, the question, are we there, meaning, can we handle this coastal tourism thing? Do we have the data, the tools, and so on, in order to give a good process, good decision process? And the answer is no. There are gaps in our knowledge, and especially gaps in our monitoring of the coastal system. So there is a need for an integrated ocean observing system in Europe as a whole, but of course, and maybe especially in the Mediterranean Sea, where we have this north-south imbalance, which is the next point, that we have this clear north-south imbalance. So there is a need also for capacity building efforts to cope with this imbalance. My impression from our session yesterday is that we have, in principle, maybe I'm a little rough here, but we have two systems, two worlds. We have a world concentrating on the coastal tourism, and we have another group that is focusing on integrated coastal zone management, providing the data and things like that. So there, I believe there is a need for these two worlds to meet, find ways how they can communicate, so that we end up in a process where, before we build many new hotels, fill the beaches with hotels and shops and so on, that there is some kind of understanding behind the decision process. It's based on data, analysis, and so on. This dialogue refers back to the conflict that I mentioned before, that there is economy, growth, jobs to take care of on one side. Politicians are very concerned about that, but we also must remember that we have the environment, the green growth to take care of as well. So, I think that was our part. Yeah.
Thank you, Erik, for another very interesting and clear presentation. I was not part of that session. I don't know whether you were there, Enrico. Sometimes. So for somebody who was not at the session, I learned a lot of interesting things on what we know and what we are supposed to know better, or at least to how to diffuse knowledge better when there are imbalances that are possibly relatively easy to rectify. I don't know whether Federico or others who participated in the session would like to add anything to the very interesting summary that Erik made.
I have a short comment. I really appreciated the presentation, and I quite agree with the need of extending the observing system to the southern part. And so this is one of the points where we have to develop more comprehensive and more uniform observing system in the Mediterranean. The other thing is, I quite agree that we have to reconcile, the two way of thinking of job creation, economy, and jobs, and the environmental sustainability. But I think that we have to change a bit the paradigm of thinking of this way, because actually a sustainable environment means also that we have to build up a new economic system where we actually go to act on the marine environment, but also the coastal environment to improve actually the system. We have to treat waters, we have to build up capacity and infrastructure which are going actually to improve the ecological status of for instance, the marine environment, but not only, also the coastal environment. And so we have really to build up a system where the two ways start to be connected. Like, for instance, as you mentioned and you plan, I think that there is a need for policymakers to start to think about the plans for tourism, where you actually set a limit of a pressure that tourism can pose on the marine environment and coastal environment. So I think that this is a very one of the very important points to be stressed very strongly.
Thank you. So the comment from the chair, I'm sure that this is a point that can be reflected in the further report and the drafting that will come. So thank again to Erik as rapporteur and to all the participants and speakers and organizer, Federico, of workshop 2. We now move to workshop 3. Oh, there is another comment? Sorry. Michael.
Thank you very much for the report. I was not, I participated in different workshops. And this is just to emphasize one point. It was excellent, both parts of the tourism and the observation systems. But in between, you put the integrated coastal zone management. And this has to be obviously clarified here. When we are talking about integrated coastal zone management, we don't deal only with one sector, tourism. We have to take all the other sectors, industry, cities, and the rest. So just to clarify that the input, the link, it does not make justice to the work you have done for observation systems are for all other sectors as well, and integrated coastal zone management is for all other sectors as well. In this case, of course, you dealt with tourism, but even tourism cannot be addressed alone without the other sectors. So just a small note, and we'll come back to the discussion on that.
Thank you. Erik, would you like to address this issue?
Yeah, I fully agree. I mean, the observation system that we are arguing for is to cover, as I mentioned in my slide, it's to cover measure once and use for several purposes, meaning other things. And if you are doing an evaluation of an area for tourism, you have to take into account what else is going on in the area. So I fully agree. And the last thing I would just to mention, I'm not alone about this reporting. Federico Falsini has helped me quite a lot because he knows Mediterranean much better than I do.
Thank you. Well, we didn't have any doubt that Federico, who actually was the organizer of the session, also helped with reporting. Actually, I think that when we have the report, we'll have, we need to put the scientific committee names quite clearly in this cover. There is another intervention on this workshop. Please. Yes. Maybe if you speak aloud or you come here and...
No, just to reassure Professor Skoulos that the ICZM and tourism were presented in a way that he was saying tourism as a part of the ICZM process and sometimes a very good vector for other sectors like agriculture, fishery, etc., etc. This was presented. I just wanted to reassure him, and of course, ICZM should deal with all these issues in an equal foot. Tourism was the subject chosen yesterday for presentation with regard to ICZM, and I really like to congratulate Erik for the presentation, for a well-structured presentation. It was not easy to give a good structure to all what was said yesterday during the session, and he tried to focus on several topics that were really also in the title of the session. So. That was really a good, well-structured summary. Thank you for that.
Thank you. we have no doubt that the fact that there is discussion on this workshop doesn't mean that the report of the rapporteur was less impressive than the previous or the future ones, but actually there was discussion also at the time of the scientific committee planning on how much this session should basically focus on the means, the observation, and how much it should focus on one of the sectors. And tourism was chosen and reasons were given about why it is important, but indeed, when we speak about integration, other sectors come. Also, this doesn't mean that the discussion in workshop 1 was less diverse and demanding. So now we move with this to workshop 3, and we have the pleasure to have as a rapporteur Ayman El-Wazzan. The workshop 3 was about building an ecosystem-based approach to fishery and aquaculture in the Mediterranean. As we all know, Fabio especially, who organized the session with other colleagues, there was a long discussion about the fact that fishery is basically in the sea, but also in rivers, and aquaculture is both a marine activity and a coastal activity in the land. And here was, again, a focus on important socioeconomic sectors, as it was the case for tourism, but considering the integration or the links between the inland and marine water. So the floor is yours, Eman. Thank you.
Thank you. At the beginning, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, and I would like to thank Fabio for giving me this opportunity. This is my first time as a rapporteur, so just forgive me if I missed some parts of the presentations, because we have very rich workshop, and the presentations were fabulous, and I tried to collect the main points from the session. As introduction about the topic of the workshop, we all know that the world is required to accommodate a large number of people through aquaculture and fisheries. However, this may not be possible due to increasing challenges, and we all know that we have climate change, marine pollution, and we have degraded fisheries in the Mediterranean, loss of biodiversity, halted aquaculture effort. Sometimes the species is cultured and it's not successful because of the pollution or other factors. Increase of temperature and climate change associated stressors is a main factor affecting both aquaculture and fisheries in the Mediterranean. Also increasing the human population and the crucial need for fresh water made us think about going to the marine aquaculture instead of inland aquaculture. All of these challenges require more targeted management for aquatic resources. What are the future challenges facing fisheries and aquaculture resource management? Of course, the climate change, we don't know what will happen on the organismal level. We know that the temperature is increasing. There are effects through the last 4 years. We have observed many effects on the boundaries of species distribution, the biodiversity, and other factors of the marine community. However, the lack of knowledge of all the possible impacts of changing the environment is still a shortage in the scientific knowledge, and they need to be addressed. The other thing is that the difficulty of integrating large number of parameters in one management system, because we have different factors and different participants in the problem. Not only the climate change, but also we have the pollution and increased human population. Another thing is inadequate communication between the scientific communities and the decision maker and the stakeholder, and we see that more in our country, in developed countries, because what we do is that we do the research and we get fabulous results and we publish it, but when we want that into effect, sometimes we are hindered by the rules or by many organizations that we are not able to accomplish the projects because of other things out of the scientists' hands. The biodiversity conservation issue is another issue because we know that the biodiversity in the world is declining, and especially in the Mediterranean. The objectives of the workshop 3 was to address the possible responses of fisheries and aquaculture in Mediterranean region to ongoing challenges that impact society and sustainable growth. These possible responses to climate change and its the challenges like climate changes and the consequences on biodiversity and species boundary, increasing coastal urbanization, general anthropogenic pressure. The other objective was reflect the role of scientific community in helping society to prepare for further challenge. Again, I'm saying that sometimes the scientists are separated from the society. And when we talk to the fishermen, oh, you don't need to fish during this time because we need to conserve our fisheries. He would say, I want to eat, I want to feed my kids. And this is what happens. So when the scientists come and advise or enforce the rules, the other parties, they don't have a choice but to unfollow the rules. So the role of scientists during the next period is to predict the environmental responses to anthropogenic pressure and impact patterns, suggest strategies for management and sustainable growth, and identify research priorities needed for the proper management and future collaboration. The other objective was motivating society to take actions to ameliorate the negative possible impacts of the fisheries on ecosystem and consider the human. Why we say consider the human? Because usually the scientists are blamed of just saying, oh, you are doing that wrong, but we are not considering the conditions of the person or the community or the society. So to get the help from the society, we have to have a link with them and to communicate with them in a proper way. This way, we involve them in the decision making rather than to order them. Enhances effective communication and the collaboration between scientists, decision makers, and the stakeholders of Euro-Mediterranean countries. And this actually is the main objective of this workshop, and suggests a strategy to plan coordinated system based on the biological resource management program. I want the speakers of the presentation to forgive me. I just wrote their name and affiliations. This way I won't pronounce any names wrong. And we had very nice presentations. We had 5 presentations in addition to the introduction and the keynote speaker. I think the battery is dying, so not me. The most important issues discussed in the workshop is the importance of the Mediterranean fisheries as one of the 64 large marine ecosystems in the world. The Mediterranean fisheries declined landing and stressors. Of course, we have declined landing due to different reasons: climate change, overfishing, aquaculture, and other anthropogenic activities. All of these topics were addressed in the presentations. The ecosystem-based approach to management is this what we want to take out of this conference. We want to work on the small spatiotemporal scales instead of the large spatiotemporal scales, and downgrading the research to go to the organismal level or the area level rather than the ecosystem itself as a whole is the main issue, especially in climate change, because we can't say, okay, the temperature will increase and everything will change in the world, and we didn't study the small scale research that will help us go up and say, okay, these are our findings and this is our recommendation for the future. We need to include the human as integral part of the system, not just to talk about what happens in the field or in the oceans without taking the human and the socio-economic conditions of the human into place. The marine protected areas tools, one of the most tools that are compatible with the ecosystem-based approach that we are talking about. The topics that we talked about in details is the climate change. This quotation I took it from one of the speakers, which is very true, which says today is globally accepted that climate change will affect aquatic ecosystem. However, there is high level of uncertainty on possible local or regional impacts. Climate change is global across the world. However, when we come to organismal level, some organisms will be winners with the climate change and some will be losers. It is based on what indicator we are taking. Are you studying lethal temperature, reproductive failure, sublethal physiological responses, and at what time and what scale? One of the speakers addressed this part in very detail, and the conclusion was that the climate change and its biological impact on ecosystem are determined by the detail of how organisms interact to their environment at a smaller spatial and temporal scale. Several models have been suggested for predicting future scenarios. However, most of the models can't work because if you do a model in one area, you can't apply it in another area, maybe the result will be different. Sometimes like a model will have been constructed in a certain year, and after a few years, when you come to use the model, the conditions are different. So the conclusion from that is that predicting future scenarios is extremely difficult, if not possible, and this to a large extent is true. The other big topic that the workshop addressed is the aquaculture. Aquaculture is considered the best candidate when we think about ameliorating the impact of industry and climate change on fisheries. Everybody say, okay, let's do aquaculture. This way we'll have a stock and we'll relieve the natural fisheries. But however, the type of aquaculture is important because some types of aquaculture, like the carnivores, for example, will stress more the fisheries because they need live feed or they need feed for the diet. And solving this problem, the integrated multi-trophic aquaculture might be a solution. Why we would choose integrated multi-trophic aquaculture? Because it's a more efficient energy recovery. It has pathogen reduction ability because they have different environmental niches and increase of economic diversity and improve social acceptability. When we do aquaculture of different species, the stakeholders will benefit more. Of course, if you do carnivores, for example, with plants and with, let's say, benthic community like the invertebrates or bivalves, for example, this will reduce the impact of, on the environment by having filter feeders, for example, and for using the energy stock that moves from one trophic level to the other. The other thing is the environmental mitigation of existing impacts or accelerated growth of co-culture species will be more when they don't compete for space and niche. Aquaculture is the most heavily regulated food production sector in Europe, and this was discussed as a problem because the regulations sometimes they hinder the effort of aquaculture. An ecosystem approach to aquaculture was suggested, and it is suggested to develop aquaculture in a sustainable way, and they can provide alternative fish source in the light of declining fisheries in the region. What is ecosystem approach to aquaculture? It is a strategy for the integration of activity within wider ecosystem, such that it promotes sustainable growth or development, equity, resilience, and interlinked social ecosystem, and at the same time can be used at any scale without harming the environment. Yeah. The Mediterranean fishery, after we talked about aquaculture, we collected the information about Mediterranean fisheries, impacts affecting them, and the obstacle of their management. Although there is evidence that ocean properties were affected by climate change during the past 40 years, it is not climate change is not the only driver that change the conditions in the oceans. Pollution, acidification, overfishing, and habitat destructions are also factors in affecting the Mediterranean fisheries. The expected impacts can be too complex to predict, because there are synergetic effects of different factors affecting the organismal level at the same time. Biological environment and the socio-economic process that come into play and interact are difficult to reconcile. Like, for example, in a case study was described in Morocco, they used the spatial approach of the management of fisheries, and they were faced with many obstacles during the approach. Like almost they said we failed in it. However, I don't think this is failure. It's just we have different cultures than the European state countries, and we need to improve ourselves as developed countries to cope with the world progress in science and in management. There is need for the awareness of involvement in maritime populations. This is what was said in the case of Morocco. We have the same problem in Egypt. If you want to do any activity in the sea, you need to take the permission of national security, different organizations. At the end, most people stop and they say, no, I don't want to do that. It's too much for me. The challenge for regulation in European countries are less than the challenges in southern Mediterranean countries, due to more enforced rules in Europe, and they do cope with the rules. I don't know if they do 100%, but at least they are more than the developed countries, and they have more skilled personnel and the interconnection between stakeholders and the policymakers. Therefore, there is need to collaboration between the European states and the countries of the South Mediterranean in the fisheries and aquaculture. Next, please. The round table discussion had a very fruitful discussion, and We have here the affiliation of different persons of the panel. The main issue regarding and what was discussed in the round table were the main issues regarding Mediterranean fisheries management. The high complexity of Mediterranean fisheries in terms of multi-species and multi-gears was one of the problems that were tackled in this session. The difficulties in producing and the agreed legal context among the Mediterranean countries due to very different socio-economic contexts. The difference in socio-economics between the North Mediterranean and the South Mediterranean is huge. The unprotected and illegal or unregulated fishing is one of the most serious threats to any management plan. Ghost fishing, bycatch, the depletion of fishery stock, destruction of benthic ecosystem, unprotected data, and all kinds of harmful nets that destruct the biodiversity and the bottom of the ocean. All these are big issues in the Mediterranean. The possible solutions were addressed, like zero tolerance to the unprotected and unregulated fishing, national fleet management, MBAs, marine protected areas, bottom conservation and recovery, co-management, adaptive management, and discard management. If anybody want to ask about details of any of this, I'm ready to answer any question. Next, please. The battery? Oh, sorry. It's okay. Okay. So, after all of that, what do we need to plan coordinated ecosystem-based biological resource management program in the Mediterranean? Management will require cross-sectoral and multidisciplinary approach to the development and management of the Mediterranean. It is fundamental to involve different stakeholders of European and non-European countries. Collaboration should involve scientists, policymakers, public and private research institutions, as well as research and innovation-derived enterprises. Because some countries, they don't have the funds to do the research, and we don't have the culture of bringing businessmen to support research. At least from like my experience in Egypt, we don't have this culture. Like businessmen don't support research, so we need to improve that. Increase the capacity of implementation of research. The European Maritime and Fisheries Fund can participate, enforce common fisheries policies, encourage the control of marine protected area. Bottom conservation and recovery is very important. And of course, we have to prevent the trolling nets and the other things that destroy the bottom of the ocean. Co-management between different parties, adaptive management, and discard management. The main conclusions and recommendations of the workshop: there is a strong agreement that the European and the Mediterranean countries need to work together to face future challenges. A collaboration agenda should involve the European countries and national and regional authorities in Europe, member states, and in the southern Mediterranean countries, taking into consideration that there are differences between the northern and the southern Mediterranean countries. We'll need time to arrive to this understanding. The stakeholders must be treated as partners in the decision decisions rather than persons who take orders from policy makers. There is a need to reform, increase in the capacity building for non-European countries, for implementation of research, for ecosystem-based approach, for protection of management of the coastal waters, and this is needed for planning the ecosystem-based approach because there is a gap knowledge and the funding sources between the two big societies which needed to drive the development. We need to be like the southern countries need to be close to the northern countries. This way, any management process will work. Step-by-step solutions of the complicated long-term problems is very crucial for making a management-based approach. Considering the human being in the ecosystem approach to fisheries is very important. EFM in the wider framework of EMP integrating in a multi-sectorial management approach activities, they should participate. Different from fisheries, like tourism must be involved, transportation, wind farms, industries, and mining. All these people need to come together to find a big plan for that collect all of them. The application of common fisheries policy is a very important measure, which the measures through fishermen compliance instead of the command and the control that used to before. The improvement of scientific basis in the decision making. Sometimes the scientist is not involved in the decision making, and this make like the research just get published in like scientific journals or whatever, and after that we don't use it. The identification of realistic targets of the objectives for the fishing sector, the need of the extent of the cooperation of the third countries. Oh, sorry. Okay, I read it, okay. Considering the management of the main target species as crucial management objective, improve spatial-based approach in fisheries management, and tackle the role of research producing agreed vision based on scientific knowledge, and enforce the rules of General Fisheries Commission for the Mediterranean and the FAO regional projects in producing cooperative research and contributing to an agreed vision of the stock status and the fisheries management in the Mediterranean. Thank you. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Shukran, Eman. I think that you really try to be very comprehensive, and of course, I assume that participants in the section could find their presentation, their points, all basically reflected in this report. I would suggest that we move directly to workshop 4. Last but not least, so this is the task of Katrin Schroeder to synthesize for us the results of the workshop, which was working on the issue of ecosystem-based management in the Mediterranean region. Katrin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, our workshop was about, as you said, the ecosystem-based management in the Mediterranean region. And before I start to give an extract of each talk, I want to give you a brief definition of what is the ecosystem-based management, since this is, has become the overarching principle now of the EU and international policies on water resources, the marine environment and their uses. So the ecosystem-based management can be defined as a management approach that recognizes the full array of interactions within the marine ecosystems. It has the goal of maintaining the marine ecosystem in a healthy, productive and resilient condition so that they can sustain human uses of the sea and provide goods and services. I have prepared a slide that resumes the main aspects that were talked about in each presentation, so to give account for all the different aspects that has been discussed. We had a presentation about the theory and the practical implementation of the ecosystem approach in the framework of the UNEP MAP Barcelona Convention by Habib El-Habir. And the theory of the ecosystem approach is that it is all about recognizing connections among marine, coastal, offshore and terrestrial systems, as well as between the ecosystems and the human societies. It is important to address the cumulative impacts of various activities that affect the ecosystems. Managing for and balancing multiple objectives that can be also conflicting objectives sometimes, and to embrace change and adapting policies throughout the management process. From the practical point of view, there is already an ecosystem approach finance project, an EU finance project that aims to strengthen the ecosystem approach in the Mediterranean region, in line with the principles of the Marine Strategy Directive. And very importantly, recently the Conference of the Parties of the Barcelona Convention agreed on good environmental status descriptors, targets and indicators for ecosystem approach. So this gives a formal commitment also for non-EU countries that are not committed by the EU directives. There is a key upcoming challenge in the roadmap of the ecosystem approach, which is the implementation of an integrated monitoring and assessment program all over the Mediterranean region. We had a very interesting talk about cumulative impacts, anthropogenic impacts in the Mediterranean Sea by Simonetta Fraschetti. She told us that in the last decade there has been made several attempts to produce map of human pressures in the marine ecosystem. In this sense, the maritime spatial planning is the framework where we can explicitly integrate the management of multiple human activities. And the interesting fact is that even if there are many different approaches to develop maritime spatial plans, the common factor of all these approaches is the consideration of the distribution of multiple stressors. And regarding multiple stressors, it is important to stress that they are not always additive. The impacts are not always additive. There are different situations where one stressor can be dominant over all other stressors, or the additive condition. Stressors can also be multiplicative and act in a synergistic way, but stressors can also mitigate each other in some cases. Simonetta addressed the issue of data resolution, since these kind of maps are very useful at the regional scale, but if you go to a smaller scale, you may notice that there is a problem of data resolution, since it appears, for instance, here in southern Italy, that coastal areas are less impacted than offshore areas, which is obviously not the case. So we have the need to improve our knowledge on multiple stressors effect, and we have to address these issues on data quality, resolution, and the fact that data are not homogeneous in time and space, and the problem of data sharing in the Mediterranean region. Joachim Messe gave a presentation about mapping and assessment of the ecosystems and their services. Here I have highlighted the services of the coastal ecosystems. He also gave addresses also the services of terrestrial ecosystems, riparian ecosystems. And this working group on mapping and assessment of ecosystem and their services is working in the framework of the Action 5 of the Biodiversity Strategy, which aims to improve the knowledge of ecosystems and their services in the EU, not only on coastal waters, of course. But for coastal ecosystems, the main services are the food provision, the regulation of water quality, coastal protection, and recreation and tourism. This working group produced also two main working documents that can guide the application, the implementation of the ecosystem-based management. And in these working documents, the working group set a conceptual model for ecosystem assessment, proposed a typology for ecosystems and their services, sets the common framework for ecosystem assessments, describes the indicators for the ecosystem condition and for the ecosystem services, and gives working guidance for actually mapping ecosystems and services. Damian Barceló gave a presentation of a complex example of transport and fate of emerging chemicals under climate change conditions, introducing also the topic of climate change that has to be considered in the ecosystem-based management. In this example, water scarcity is considered as the central stressor. I don't know why it's this way. It's the central stressor that can lead to impact on other stressors that are affecting the ecosystem. So in river catchments under water scarcity, we have also higher hydrological variability, higher frequency of extreme events. We may have higher water temperature and higher concentrations of nutrients as well as of inorganic pollutants and emerging contaminants. On the other side, higher temperatures may facilitate the introduction of new pathogens, and via food web we have a higher indirect human exposure to these pathogens and chemicals from agriculture. Dries Nashita presented an example of application of ecosystem-based management principles in Moroccan waters, in particular in the lagoon of Nador. And since Morocco is one of the contracting party in the context of the Barcelona Convention, it has initiated measures and policies for the application of the ecosystem-based management. He reported that the main obstacles they found in this application were of two kinds. There was a problem of legislation gaps. So there are gaps in regulations about water protection and management concerning fishing and aquaculture, and some implementation measures as well. And the second obstacle was the monitoring gap. So in Morocco, the national strategy for monitoring marine and coastal areas and water relies on too many institutions and agencies at various levels of responsibility that sometimes are overlapping. Finally, we had a presentation by Celia Vasiliki-Vassilopoulou about the ecosystem-based management as the basis for integrated coastal management and maritime spatial planning. So the ecosystem-based management process is place-based, it is site-specific. And this is the link to the maritime spatial planning as well. 2011, the UNEP proposed the different phases for the implementation of ecosystem-based management processes, starting from a visioning phase, going to a planning phase, and then to the implementation phase. In July 2014, so this year, we finally had a EU directive on maritime spatial planning, where the maritime spatial planning is defined as aiming to achieve simultaneously social, economic, and ecological objectives by means of a more rational and scientifically based organization of the use of ocean space. In particular, in this directive, Article 4 emphasizes that the member states shall take into account land-sea interactions, and Article 5 commits the member states to apply an ecosystem-based approach in the maritime spatial planning. Celia also stressed the importance of participative approaches for maritime spatial planning, since it is a multiple objectives processes where we need to find a balance between hard and soft sustainability approaches. The roundtable after the presentations has been organized around 4 questions that has been proposed by the moderator, Maria Vetti. And these 4 questions were, can we define priorities for ecosystem-based management and ecosystem services in the Mediterranean region? Are there synergies that should be explored for looking at ecosystem services for freshwater, riparian, coastal, and marine domains? How should we best engage non-EU countries in ecosystem-based management and mapping and assessing ecosystem services for the Mediterranean region? And where can we prioritize investments in green and blue infrastructures which deliver synergies? And the main outcomes of the discussion during the roundtable and also during the presentations are summarized in the next few slides. So the ecosystem-based approach, ecosystem-based management aims to protect the environment, but needs also to be a tool for sustainable development. As I said before, finding a balance between hard sustainability approach and soft sustainability approach. It is a process which is place-based in that it is focused on a specific ecosystem and the range of human activities that affect this ecosystem, and it needs therefore to account for land-sea connections. We have a strong need of prioritization of choices and services, both environmental and socio-economic, because some priorities are already clear, but others have to be ranked as yet. The maritime spatial planning is an essential tool for ecosystem-based management, and it is a way to analyze and allocate spatial temporal distribution of human activities in marine areas to achieve the ecological, economic, and social objectives that are defined through a political process in which the stakeholders' involvement is an important component. From the point of view of research and innovation, EBM, ecosystem-based management, seems to be knowledge limited rather than data limited, at least in the Mediterranean region. We have, in fact, important gaps in knowledge on different aspects, going from dynamics and resilience of populations, communities, and ecosystems, on the effects of multiple stressors and cumulative impacts. We have an important knowledge gap on the effect of global climate change on all other impacts, and since all activities are destined to be influenced by climate change, the management plans have to be updated on a periodic basis to assess changes that are due to global climate change. Regarding data, EBM is not data limited, but it is rather limited by the access to this data. And the Mediterranean region is suffering generally from the problem of data ownership and data accessibility. However, data are also unevenly distributed in time and space, and some countries do actually need more data. So in some cases, there is also data limitation to ecosystem-based management plans. As I already said before, the ecosystem-based management plans requires an improved understanding of the land-sea interactions. From the more geopolitical and legal point of view, we have a strong need for a harmonized legal framework. We have the EU countries where the directives and the policies have adopted the ecosystem-based management principles. And at the Mediterranean level, the Conference of Parties of the Barcelona Convention has recently adopted the ecosystem approach. So it is important to have a common pathway for both the EU policies and the decision of the Conference of Parties of the Barcelona Convention. As a recommendation, I have put this, that there is a priority for close cooperation among different initiatives, so for investment, infrastructures, policies, and management choices, which all should be coherent with the shared goals. Also, the point of legally binding policies have been addressed during the discussion, and there was an agreement that there is a need of policies that are really legally binding for countries to have successful implementation of ecosystem-based management. And we need a better definition of maritime zones. There is a strong need of bridging the differences between countries of the northern shore and the southern shore in terms of knowledge, in terms of policies and management plans. And this should be done by means of capacity building programs, training, education, common projects between northern and southern shores, permanent networking, as well as raising the awareness of ecosystem problems among citizens. The importance of the participative approaches is also highlighted to generate proactive solutions to problems. So a key challenge is the interface between science and policy. What came out during the workshop is that the Mediterranean region is also a great opportunity to test new economy models that are based on new modes to handle the access and to benefit sharing. For example, in the framework of the marine biotechnologies. As well, it came out that the Mediterranean area is one of the most advanced and best case study in the context of regional seas for testing the effects of the ecosystem-based management plans and to give indications and to extend the practice also to other regional seas in the world. Regarding knowledge of structure and processes regulating the ocean function, the Mediterranean is one of the best known systems to date with special emphasis on the way biodiversity is distributed in some subregions. For example, the Adriatic Sea is very well studied from this point of view, and the way the climate change is affecting water mass circulation. So to conclude, I just want to make a reference to the Rome Declaration of 2014, since all these issues that came out during our discussions are fully in line with what came out during the Eurasian conference in October a few weeks ago. And the goals of the Rome Declaration are valuing the ocean, promoting a wider awareness of the importance of the seas among citizens, capitalizing on European leadership, so reinforce Europe as a global leader in marine science and technology, advancing ocean knowledge by ocean observation and both fundamental and applied research, and breaking barriers, addressing the complex challenges of blue growth and ocean sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you, Katrin. Another very comprehensive report. Now, I guess that you are both hungry to contribute to the discussion, but also to have lunch. So I would say, if there are urgent issues that either Roberto, Maria, or other participants to this session, or Fabio or others to session 3 would like to contribute here and share publicly, otherwise those will be shared at lunch. Yes, there is one point, please.
Thank you. First of all, I have to thank Eman for nice summary for the workshop 3. I would like to add one small or very small mistake in this unprotected fisheries. Instead of she has to say that illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. It is mistaken there. Did you understand what I said?
Not really. You're saying legal, unprotected.
Illegal, unreported, unregulated, instead of unprotected and illegal. If you look at the text, you can see there very easily. Another issue is the missing is invasive alien species or alien species issue. So we have to insert it there. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. That will be the task for the next days when we will complete the reporting and so on. Thank you, Eman. That's okay for you. There is a point over there.
Thanks. I was one of the speakers in session 3. I just want to make one clarification. One of those slides is based on talks that Jean-Luc and I gave. The point wasn't that we can't forecast the future and that we can't make predictions. Is that we have higher confidence by understanding organisms' responses because ecosystems are emergent properties of how organisms interact with each other in the environment. So it's basically we can forecast the future, but there are difficulties and we have to look at our confidence levels and their uncertainties as well.
Okay, thank you. Any point on the workshop 4, or are we fine? Thank you. We noted, of course, also the point of complementarity. That's part of the process of building up and taking stock on the Rome Declaration. Of course, the setting of having EuroMed cooperation is more, how to say, it's one of the additional value of this conference, but definitely there is dialogue between Rome and Naples and several other initiatives. In fact, the roundtable of this afternoon will have as a main point to see how do we take stock of what we have of several initiatives, mainly European initiative in our case, and how the results of this very conference, this discussion, your contribution, are inputs that can inform those initiatives, and if those initiatives are not enough and there are gaps to be seen, then let's see what those gaps are that should be filled by something else. But the idea is that this discussion is identifying lot of things we know, a lot of things that we know we cannot do very much about maybe, but also a lot of things that we need to know better in order to inform our actions. And part of it is that we have to put it together with what are some of the main research initiatives and platforms that are ongoing to see, in addition to those presented actually, that can help us to take this, this work forward. With this, if Enrico agrees, we might...
Yeah, I just would like to thank all the rapporteurs for the very beautiful work. I mean, they did. I mean, very comprehensive report on the different workshop. I would suggest that all these reports should go into the general report of the conference. Probably we need just some harmonization of the different contributions, and especially I would suggest to have for each one, I mean, a limited number of take-home messages to avoid to be too comprehensive and to put too many things together. So in the next few days we will work probably on this, and we will discuss this probably during the afternoon section as well. Thank you very much. And thank you to Angela for helping and doing most of the job with these reports. Thank you.
Thanks, Enrico. So lunch is outside, and we reconvene at 2 p.m. here. Thank you.